It was either Thursday or Friday. I made a video where I said that the share and address show was washed up and they should just shut it down, wrap it up. You know, your run is over. Well, guess what happened Saturday night? No share and address show. Hmm. Not gonna say that was because of me. Could have just been unforeseen circumstances. However, if you are in fact closing up shop, then it is because of me. You know, I put you motherfuckers on the set, and I can take you off the set. Even though Bum made a video trying to hunt down some roadside 40 ounce or some shit. I don't know. Yeah, that's enough nonsense for today. I gotta focus. I got an 8.1% ass 40 ounce because 8.1 is ass. Still reserved 211. Fucking sucks, man. I'm not gonna say it sucks. Let me retract that because it will never suck taking away plastic and putting it back in glass. That does not suck. However, uh, since they took it out of the plastic and put it back in glass, I've not found a glass 6%. They were only in plastic. Siete.
Is the entire question that explains it in a way that's a lot less denigrating towards the human species than the simplistic, attitude of, well, they're having a good time watching this person suffer and die. The Roman example is the most damning I can find, that forces you to look into a mirror. And if you're trying to make the case that human beings are inherently good, inherently empathetic, and inherently, with a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood toward their fellow man, you have to hold this as exhibit A and say, well, then, how do you explain this? So then, of course, the question arises briefly and not without controversy. If these things were so popular, why the heck did they disappear? And the answers, of course, are less simplistic and more argued about than they used to be. I still think most of the historians that you'll look at will acknowledge that there's a role in the change in sensibility, shall we call them, between a minority Christian Rome and one that was increasing in, importance in that society, right? The ethics were changing, and the views on things like the arena and how moral something like that was were also changing. Now, let's be honest, even if it wasn't for ethical reasons connected to their faith, you could understand why Christians might think the game sucked. I mean, look at how many Christians met their end in these arenas for, well, let's be honest, their countrymen's entertainment in many cases. There's an interesting twist on this, by the way, this idea that Christianity may have helped kill the games, but it hasn't anything to do with a growth in refinement of sensibilities and all that. It has to do with, maybe you could call it, a scheduling conflict. I mean, for example, the games themselves were happening a couple of times a year, like mini Olympics, and that just happens to be the time when you had, some of the more serious holiday periods for Christians. And so maybe we're talking about something here that has to do with a question of scheduling conflicts, as I said, leading to a reduction in consumer demand, maybe. There's another theory that these things had only existed as long as they had because the emperors gave them all the support because it helped, the whole bread and circuses thing. Well, these are the circuses, right? They play a role for the emperor. They play a mystical role that connect the emperor to the subjects. I mean, there's a whole lot of theories about this. Once it stops doing that to the same degree, there's no reason for the emperor to go to those great expenses and all that other trouble. Might as well just have a nice chariot race and call it good. I should point out, too, that these Roman traditions where they have these games, these go way back in their history, and they actually involved other Italian peoples like Samnites and Etruscans and people who would have sometimes at funerals and whatnot these duels. And duels are not that uncommon throughout history. It was this Roman, as we said, layering when we talked about the animals, but layered on all the different levels of performance and attraction. And I mean, these things, as we said, were like a variety show with the violence as sort of the headliner acts. But I read that they didn't die out all at once, and that even quite a bit of time later, after emperors and whatnot had tried to get rid of them, they were still popping up here or there. So, maybe not quite getting the ratings they used to get, but still bopping around, the off-Broadway circuit and, pulling into locals every now and then for a little, gory equivalent of old-fashioned dinner theater, maybe. Now, if this were a program dealing with executions or criminal law or criminal justice or the penal system or anything like that, there'd be a lot of examples to go into where you're seeing public executions all over the world all the time. It's depressingly familiar. But what you don't have is the kind of evidence that Rome provided of what the mentality of the crowd watching was. And nowhere else do you really see such raw enjoyment. For example, it's very possible that those Japanese people living nearby, what did we say, a convict being boiled to death, sometimes that happened, and if it did, that might be unusual, and you might want to go watch. And so, you pick up a few friends, and you go get some food, and you go down to the beach to have some fun. Certainly might have happened in my cynical way of looking at things sometimes. I imagine it probably did, but I don't have the written sources in English to prove it. The next place that I can prove it, or at least make a logical case with some evidence, is a lot nearer to our own time than Rome was. Perhaps a little bit more of an indictment. It's one thing to try to say that those ancient people living thousands of years ago were almost a different species from us, but it's much harder to claim that when you're talking about a time period, say, as we said, when George Washington is a young adult and Robert Francois Damien is being torn apart over 4 hours in front of tens of thousands of early modern French spectators. George Washington's lifespan's actually not a bad historical marker for this conversation, because over his lifespan, these sorts of spectacular, grotesquely medieval torture executions will go out of fashion. Washington, of course, born in the early 1730s, died on the cusp of the 19th century. I think it was December 1799, lived during a period often labeled in your high school history textbooks as the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. Those kinds of executions don't sound very enlightened, do they? And they were passing away during this era for a bunch of interesting reasons. But the reason that we can use it to examine our question of, people and violence and the extremes of the human experience is we get these sources, really an explosion in sources, starting at around the 16th century. So from 1500 to about 1800, you can really see this entire question from multiple viewpoints in ways you've never been able to before. And I think that's why if you buy reading material in English on this subject, it is inordinately concentrated on the period from 1500 to the early 1800s and in Western Europe, because the sources are plentiful and from multiple viewpoints. Take, for example, one of the most interesting. There is nothing from the Roman era that gives you the perspective of the person whose job it was to execute people in the arena. What the guy who had to do all these horrible things to the condemned think, right? You wouldn't know. But we have the equivalent of a diary kept by an executioner in Germany in the 16th century. How amazing is it to have that point of view to add, to try to three-dimensionalize this? And what about the condemned themselves. Again, nothing from the Roman arena on how that poor individual felt before they went through what they went through. But in the era we're talking about, the condemned could speak sometimes. And what they said was written down and transmitted. And then, of course, we have an audience that you can examine now from multiple viewpoints over multiple centuries in multiple countries. So if you want to examine this fascination with the spectacularity of death and people's interest in it, this is perhaps the best laboratory we can work within, because there's a lot of data to synthesize. Now, the problem in talking about this is there is a lot of variation, region to region, era to era, and so any generalized statements are bound to be false in some way. So I hope I can count on your indulgence on this to try to get us to where we have to be to have a discussion about this. We're going to generalize, but if you want to understand what happened that allowed modern people, from the Louis XIV era of the Enlightenment to go to these torture executions and enjoy themselves, you have to kind of understand how it got that way, right? We have to have some context. And as a bridge to maybe take us backward for some context, I was thinking of a reform that a couple of rulers during George Washington's lifetime implemented. But they were secret reforms, which is kind of interesting. For example, Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was considered one of the Enlightenment rulers, a guy who didn't just, read people like Voltaire, the famous Enlightenment thinkers. He was a pen pal. And so he was one of these people that implemented changes that's part of all this stuff that we broadly call the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. And one of the things that Frederick the Great did was reform the legal system in the 1740s. Now, he did away with a couple of medieval type executions. I mean, I think he got rid of burning, for example, couldn't burn somebody alive anymore. I think